They said I should let it go. But how do you let go when your own parents take the train to your sister's wedding and pretend you don't exist? I didn't chase them. I didn't speak. I just watched. Then came the scandal. The lawyer, the headlines, the calls from a mother who finally realized what peace costs. I'm Claire Hartman, and this is how being erased became my quiet revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe /like button and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Saturday mornings in Seattle always felt the same. Gray cold and half awake, I stood on the platform of King Street Station with a lukewarm coffee in one hand and my laptop bag slung over the other shoulder waiting for the commuter train to Bellevue. My calendar was clear, my day predictable, until my phone buzzed. Aunt Lorraine's name lit up the screen. The message was short. Good luck to Emily today. I frowned. Good luck for what? My thumb hovered over the screen. Then I scrolled through social media out of habit. And there it was. A photo posted just minutes ago. My parents, Thomas and Margaret, standing on another platform dressed in elegant clothes. My mother's navy dress, my father's suit. Emily's white gown glowing even in the low light. The caption read, "On our way to Napa Valley." Couldn't be happier. My heart dropped into my stomach. I zoomed in on the photo, scanning their faces for some mistake, some sign that this wasn't what it looked like. But it was. My entire family was leaving for my sister's wedding, and no one had told me. I felt a rush of cold air as a train pulled in behind me. People brushed past the hiss of brakes mixing with the hum of morning chatter. I swallowed hard, grabbed my bag, and called a cab. When I arrived at the Amtrak station downtown, the departure board was flashing Train 114 to San Francisco. Now boarding. Through the glass doors, I saw them. My family. 3 figures I'd known my whole life standing together like a picture-perfect frame. My mother adjusting Emily's veil, my father laughing Emily's hands full of flowers. The people I'd spent years trying to please. The people who left without me. I pushed through the crowd, my breath visible in the cold. "Mom!" I shouted. "Mom, wait!" She turned halfway startled. Her eyes met mine for a second, wide and uncertain. Then she looked away, pulling her phone from her purse. My phone rang, almost immediately. "Claire," her voice came through, tight rehearsed. "Please, don't come here." "What?" my voice cracked. "You're all going to Emily's wedding," and no one thought to tell me. There was a pause long enough for me to hear the echo of the station's loudspeaker behind her. "Claire," she said softly, "we just wanted today to be peaceful. You have a way of stirring things up." I froze. The words didn't sound angry. They sounded final. I bit my lip until I tasted metal. "So you decided to erase me. Don't make this harder than it has to be." My throat burned. "I'm not making it hard, Mom. You already did." The train whistle blew. People hurried past carrying bags and flowers. Steam from the engine rolled across the platform, wrapping me in white. On the other end of the line, she said, "We'll talk later, okay?" I stared at the window where her reflection flickered beside Emily's. "No," I said quietly. "You won't." I ended the call. The train doors slid shut with a metallic hiss. My mother turned her face away, helping Emily up the steps. My father didn't even look in my direction. The wheels screeched against the track. Then the train began to move. I stood still, my coffee cooling in my hand, my breath fogging the air. The rumble under my feet faded until it was only memory. I wanted to scream, to run, to throw something, but nothing came out. Just the sound of my own breathing and the faint announcement for the next train. Someone else's destination. For a long moment, I didn't move. People passed, brushing against me like I wasn't there. In the distance, the silver train curved out of view, its light blinking once before vanishing into the fog. I whispered to no one. They wanted peace. I'll give it to them. And for the first time in my life, I meant it. I turned toward the empty track, letting the steam swallow me whole. The platform was silent again, except for the soft hum of rails cooling beneath the morning air. A week passed. Seattle rain never stopped tapping against my apartment windows, like it was trying to remind me of something I didn't want to remember. I sat at my desk on the 9th floor, freelancing on a design project I didn't care about, just trying to stay busy enough not to think. My coffee had gone cold again. The cursor blinked on a half-finished layout waiting for direction I couldn't give. The soft chime of an email broke the silence. My stomach tightened when I saw the sender. Aunt Lorraine. Subject line, the perfect Hartman wedding. For a second, I didn't open it. I already knew what it would be, but curiosity, or maybe pain, has a way of winning. The first image loaded slowly. Emily in a white lace gown, holding a bouquet of pale roses. Margaret and Thomas stood behind her smiling. The kind of smile people practice for cameras, the kind that says everything's fine. They looked happy, whole, finished. I clicked to the next photo. My mother raising a glass, my father laughing mid-toast, then a wide shot of the guests. My eyes caught a small, almost hidden detail. A single empty chair in the front row, decorated with a white ribbon like the others, but vacant. A space meant for someone who never showed up, or someone they never invited. I stared at that empty chair until my vision blurred. I don't know what hurt more. Being forgotten or being remembered just enough to leave a seat for me. Another message came in from Aunt Lorraine. "Sweetheart, I thought you declined. Margaret said you didn't want to come." My jaw tightened. I typed 3 words. "That's not true," then deleted them. Instead, I closed the laptop, the click of it louder than it should have been. Rain hammered harder against the window. I unlatched it, letting the cold air in. The city smelled like wet concrete and old coffee. I took a deep breath, but it didn't help. I walked to the wall by my bed where a photo from my 23rd birthday still hung. The 4 of us arms around each other. Margaret's hand rested on Emily's shoulder. Not mine. I pulled the photo down. The tape gave way with a soft rip. I studied it under the yellow light, then tore it straight down the middle. I didn't cry. I just felt empty, like the space between 2 torn halves of paper. I dropped the pieces in the trash. My phone buzzed again, a reminder from my company calendar. All staff meeting, 8 a.m. tomorrow. Of course. The world doesn't pause just because your heart does. I poured myself another cup of coffee and stood by the window watching the rain turn the city lights into streaks of color. Somewhere below, a siren wailed and faded into the distance. The sound felt strangely familiar, like the echo of a train leaving the station. I thought about that platform, about the way the air had gone silent after the train disappeared. That moment had stretched into the whole week, into this apartment, into me. People think betrayal is loud, a fight, a door slam, words you can't take back. But sometimes it's quiet. It's a text that never comes, a chair that stays empty, a smile that looks too genuine. I shut the window and leaned my forehead against the glass. The reflection staring back looked older somehow. They said they wanted peace. Maybe they finally got it. And maybe this was mine. Silence, thick enough to drown in. The rain softened to a mist. I turned off the lamp, and the room went dark except for the flicker of a neon sign from the diner across the street. Its light pulsed red and blue on the wall like breathing. I watched it until the shapes blurred together, until I couldn't tell if the wetness on my face was rain or something else. Then I sat back at my desk, stared at the empty email window, still open on the screen, and whispered to no one. When people decide to leave you, they don't always say it. Sometimes they just send a picture. I closed the laptop again. The city went quiet. The clock ticked once, twice. And for the first time since that platform, I let the darkness stay. Monday mornings at Cascade Media always smelled like burnt espresso and disinfectant. I walked through the glass doors, my reflection split across a wall-sized poster that read, "Inspire Women." The irony almost made me laugh. My ID badge beeped for what I didn't know would be the last time. Martin Davis was waiting in his office door, half open. He smiled like someone about to deliver bad news gently, as if tone could soften a knife. "Come in, Claire. Have a seat." I sat down across from him. Papers lay scattered on his desk, HR forms, with my name printed on them. He rubbed the bridge of his nose before speaking. "This isn't easy. HR received a call from your mother last week." The word mother hit harder than it should have. "What?" "She said you've been under a lot of stress," he continued carefully, "that you've been having anxiety attacks. She thought it might be best if you took some time off." I blinked. "She called you," he nodded. "She called HR first." "They passed it to me. She doesn't work here." "I know," he said quietly, "but she was convincing." I felt my pulse in my throat. "Martin, I've never missed a deadline. I've handled 6 campaigns this quarter alone. He looked down at his hands. Claire, I believe you, but once HR logs something like this, it's procedure. You can reapply in 6 months. 6 months. I stared at him. The wall behind him showed a slideshow of smiling women in ads I'd designed taglines about empowerment flashing beneath them. It's funny, I said, finally, my voice flat. We tell women to own their voice, to take control of their lives, and I'm losing my job because my mother said I was tired. Martin's shoulders slumped. If it were up to me. It's not, I cut in. It never is. He didn't argue. He slid a white envelope across the desk. I'm sorry, Claire. You'll get your final check by the end of the week. I stood the envelope untouched. Don't be. You're not the first man to take my mother's word over mine. The hallway outside was too bright. The glass walls reflected my face a dozen times as I walked toward my desk. My coworkers looked up, then quickly away, the kind of silence that happens when people sense something contagious. Renee stood by my cubicle, arms crossed, worry written all over her face. What happened, HR? Thinks I need rest. That's ridiculous. I handed her my badge, the lanyard still warm from my neck. Keep it. Maybe frame it. In memory of professional women everywhere. She followed me to the elevator. Claire, don't do this. We can appeal it. I shook my head. No. It's fine. Just another Hartman story. Someone decides what's best for me, and I deal with it. The elevator doors slid open. As they closed between us, Renee whispered, You don't deserve this. I know, I said, but she didn't hear me. Outside, the rain had started again, soft and gray like Seattle always promised. I walked without an umbrella past the morning traffic, past the coffee cart, where I used to stop every day. The city blurred in the puddles at my feet. I reached the light rail station and stood near the platform edge. A train whooshed by, wind whipping my hair across my face. For a second, I closed my eyes and let the sound fill my ears. The hum of electricity, the screech of metal against metal. It sounded exactly like the one that had taken my family away. Mom wanted me to stop, to slow down. Maybe she got what she wanted. But no one told her that stopping doesn't always mean staying still. Sometimes it just means walking away. I rode the train to the last stop without caring where it went. The windows fogged up with stranger's breath, and I wrote my name in the mist with my fingertip before wiping it away. When I stepped off, the rain had eased. The air smelled like steel and wet asphalt. I tilted my head up toward the gray sky and let the water hit my face. Somewhere behind me, another train pulled in, doors sliding open, people rushing out and in again. I didn't move. I smiled, small and bitter, the kind of smile that only comes when everything breaks the way it always does. Then I turned and started walking toward the sound of the rails, my reflection flashing across the glass of the departing cars. One last version of myself slipping out of frame. The apartment looked smaller once everything was in boxes. Walls that had held 7 years of my life were suddenly bare, the nail holes like tiny open mouths. I stacked my last box near the door, books I couldn't quite part with, and stared at the paper on the table. Lease termination. Effective next month. My signature at the bottom felt like a confession. Not everyone leaves because they want a new beginning. Sometimes they just want the noise to stop. I sold half my furniture on Craigslist, gave away dishes to a neighbor, packed only what fit in the back seat of my car. When I locked the door for the last time, the sound of the latch echoed longer than it should have. The drive from Seattle to Cannon Beach took 5 hours. Rain followed me the entire way, streaking across the windshield in diagonal lines, like the sky couldn't let go either. I didn't play music. The hum of the tires and the hiss of wet pavement were enough. By the time I reached the Oregon coast, the fog was thick enough to hide the horizon. The ocean looked like a giant exhale. My cabin sat on a bluff, just above the beach, wooden, weathered, but solid. When I opened the door, the hinges groaned. Inside smelled like salt and pine and thyme. Light slanted through the window, hitting the dust in slow motion. There was no sound except the faint crash of waves and the creak of old floorboards. For the first time in months, I didn't feel watched. I dropped my keys on the counter, found an old radio on the shelf, and turned it on just to hear another human voice. Static. Then a cheerful announcer. And this weekend, the wedding of the year. Emily Hartman Brooks and Andrew Brooks celebrate their love in beautiful Napa Valley. I turned it off. There was a bottle of wine I'd brought for no reason other than habit. I poured a glass, raised it toward the window. "Congratulations, Emily," I said to the sea. "You win." The wind answered with a low whistle through the cracks in the doorframe. I walked outside to the porch. The air was heavy with salt, the kind that sticks to your skin. My phone buzzed once, a notification I didn't check. The screen went dark. I left it that way. Across the dune, a man was working on the porch of the next cabin, mid-30s, tall sleeves rolled up, hammering a board into place. He noticed me watching and raised a hand in greeting. "Hey there," he called out. "Exile or vacation?" The question caught me off guard. Maybe both. I said, "Depends on who you ask." He smiled, leaning on the railing. "I'm Ethan," he said. "Architect, part-time handyman. Guess that's how I pay for my own exile." "Claire," I replied. "Former designer, full-time mistake." He laughed, the sound easy. "Nice to meet you, full-time mistake. You fixing up this place or running from something? Running's easier when you don't call it that," I said. He reached into his toolbox, pulled out a small wooden mallet, and tossed it underhand across the sand between us. I caught it barely. "First thing you should fix," he said, "is that window. The wind'll tear it apart if you leave it open." I looked down at the mallet in my hand. "I'll keep that in mind. Don't let the sea take too much," he added, then went back to work, humming to himself. Back inside, I tested the window. It stuck for a second, then gave way. The ocean air rushed in cool and sharp. Papers on the counter lifted and fluttered to the floor. Receipts, sketches, pieces of an old life that didn't matter anymore. I let them go. I stood there feeling the wind thread through my hair, hearing the faint rhythm of Ethan's hammer in the distance. The sound was steady, comforting in its repetition. He was talking about fixing windows, but I knew he meant something else. Night came early. The fog thickened, swallowing the edge of the beach. I found a blanket in the closet and sat by the open window with my glass of wine, watching the lights from the next cabin glow faintly through the mist. The world was quiet, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I whispered to the dark. "You wanted peace, Mom. I think I finally found it." The wind didn't answer, but the sound of waves filled the silence where her voice used to be. When I stood to close the window, another gust blew in, scattering the few sketches left on the counter. They lifted, circled once in the dim light, and slipped out through the gap into the night air. I didn't chase them. I watched until they disappeared into the fog, small white ghosts drifting toward the sea. The air smelled like sawdust and salt. By late afternoon, the fog had thinned, letting a warm orange light spill across the dunes. I sat on the steps of my porch legs, pulled in, watching Ethan cut planks of cedar for his porch railing. Each thud of his hammer landed steady, almost rhythmic. It felt like a heartbeat I could borrow. He wiped his hands on his jeans and looked up. "You know, I used to hate the sound of construction. Reminded me of the house I left behind." I leaned my head against the post. "Your ex's, yeah." He nodded, keeping his eyes on the nail he was setting. "We built a house outside Bend. My parents came by one weekend and told me she wasn't what they wanted. Not polished enough, I guess. Not the right kind of woman for a Reed." He drove the nail in with one clean hit. A year later, she was gone. So were they. I didn't say anything. Sometimes silence was the only answer that didn't make things worse. He glanced over, half smiling. "Guess we both got exiled." I let out a soft laugh. "Exile's not so bad if the scenery's decent." We worked in companionable quiet after that. He handed me sandpaper, I passed him nails. The sound of gulls overhead filled the pauses. The sky bled into gold. In the evenings, we started sharing small things. A pot of coffee in the morning, soup on windy nights. He fixed my broken porch light. I painted a small sign for his tool shed. No promises, no explanations, just small exchanges that made the days feel less hollow. One night, he caught me sketching at the kitchen table. "You still draw." "I never stopped," I said, pencil hovering above the paper. He leaned closer, eyes scanning the page. "What's that supposed to be? Lines of train tracks stretched across the sketchbook, fading into mist." I hesitated, then said, "It's the moment I disappeared." He studied it for a beat, then nodded. "You draw like someone who's been watching from the outside for a long time." "I have." He smiled faintly, then left me to finish. The next morning, I heard the crunch of gravel as a delivery truck pulled up. The driver climbed out, holding a manila envelope. "Claire Hartman." "Yeah." He had me sign, then left without a word. My name typed neatly across the front in bold letters. From the office of Janet Cole, attorney at law. I carried it inside and sat on the floor, legs folded. The seal tore easily like it had been waiting for me. I unfolded the letter, reading slowly. Effective immediately, you have been removed as a beneficiary from the Hartman family trust. The words blurred as I read them again. Removed, beneficiary, trust, all of them hollow, legal, clean, like they'd found a way to erase me without ever saying my name. My hands shook. I let out a small, strange laugh, the kind that sounds like someone else's voice. Tears fell onto the paper, spreading the ink just enough to make the sentence unreadable. When people erase you on paper, they think you stop existing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ocean wind pressed against the cabin walls, whispering through the cracks. I stared at the ceiling, the shadows moving with the flicker of the porch light Ethan had fixed. Around 2 a.m., I got up, walked to the table, and looked at my sketch again. The train tracks the fog, the empty space where I'd drawn myself once before. I ripped the page down the middle, then taped it back together. Imperfect, fractured, mine. By dawn, the sky outside the window turned pink and silver. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, barefoot on the wooden steps. Ethan's cabin was quiet, his tools neatly stacked. The tide had gone out, leaving pools of water that reflected the rising sun. I whispered to the sea, "I'm not gone. I'm just quiet for a while." The breeze carried the words away, scattering them across the sand. The first sunlight broke through the fog, landing warm on my face. It didn't feel like forgiveness yet, but it felt like a beginning. Tacoma smelled like rain and cedar, a softer kind of gray than Seattle. The drive there took less than 2 hours, but it felt longer, like each mile was another step back into a past I hadn't agreed to revisit. Aunt Lorraine's house sat on a quiet street lined with maples that had already started to lose their leaves. The porch light was on, even though it was midday. She must have seen my car from the window, because by the time I got to the door, she was already opening it. "Claire," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and something heavier. "You made it." I hugged her before I could change my mind. Her sweater smelled like old perfume and laundry soap. "I needed to see you." She pulled back, studying my face. "You look tired." "I am." Everything was the same as I remembered. The lace curtains, the faded rug, the wall of framed photographs. My family frozen in different decades, different smiles. The clock above the mantel ticked with a slow, deliberate sound, like it was marking something more than time. I nodded toward one of the photos. "You knew about the wedding, didn't you?" Her lips tightened. "I did. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't think you'd want to hear another version of the truth." I felt my throat close. Another version. She sighed and motioned toward the couch. "Sit, honey." When I did, she disappeared into the hallway and came back with a small wooden box, the kind that looks too fragile to hold anything important. She placed it on my lap. "I kept this for a long time. I wasn't sure when, or if. You should see it." The hinges creaked when I lifted the lid. Inside, a few folded papers yellowed at the edges and a single black and white photo. My mother, younger, standing beside a train car, one hand on her stomach, the other shading her eyes from the sun. She looked different, softer, almost hopeful. "What is this?" I asked. Lorraine took one of the papers and unfolded it carefully. "It's a report from Portland General Hospital, 1989. Margaret slipped getting off a train. She was 7 weeks pregnant." I stared at the words. The letters blurred. "She lost the baby." Lorraine nodded. She never talked about it again. Not to anyone. After that, she couldn't even look at train stations. When she found out she was pregnant with you a few years later, she changed. She kept you at arm's length. I think she thought if she didn't get too close, she couldn't lose you. The clock ticked again, louder this time. I looked at the photo in my hands. Margaret by the train. I'd never seen her look so alive. So that's why I whispered. That's why she's always held me like I was made of glass, and dropped me anyway. Lorraine sat beside me, her hands warm over mine. "Your mother loved you, Claire. She just didn't know how. The only language she ever learned was fear." I tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "That doesn't make it hurt less." "I know." I stared at the window, the sky outside turning from gray to silver. "Do you forgive her?" Lorraine tilted her head. "Forgiveness isn't about deciding she was right. It's about deciding you don't have to carry her pain anymore." I thought about that, about how long I'd been dragging her mistakes behind me, like a suitcase with a broken wheel. She pointed to the photo again. "Your mother never meant to make you the ghost of what she lost, but that's what happens when people don't face what broke them." I nodded slowly. Maybe I've been doing the same thing, carrying something I don't need. She squeezed my hand. Then leave it here, Claire. Let it stay buried with that box. We sat quietly, the kind of silence that feels like truce. When I finally stood to go, she followed me to the door. Take care of yourself, she said. You deserve more than what she knew how to give. Outside, the air smelled of wet leaves and steel. As I walked to my car, a distant train horn echoed through the valley, low and steady. I paused, listening. Maybe it was the same line my mother had taken all those years ago. Maybe not. Either way. I understood her a little better now, not enough to absolve her, but enough to stop letting her ruin me. I placed the box on the passenger seat, the wood smooth under my fingertips. As I started the engine, the radio came to life with a soft static before a familiar tune faded in. A slow, old jazz song I remembered from childhood. My mother used to hum it when she cleaned the house before everything turned brittle between us. I turned the volume up and pulled onto the road. The sun had dipped low, cutting through the clouds in thin, golden beams. For a brief moment, it hit the windshield, lighting up the dust motes floating in the air like fragments of something once whole. The train horn sounded again, closer this time. I didn't look back. I just kept driving toward the edge of the gray horizon, the wooden box beside me, the song looping quietly through the static. The morning light came in dull and flat, the kind of gray that made the ocean look like it hadn't slept either. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, waiting for the coffee to brew, when my phone started buzzing on the counter. One vibration after another, until it sounded like a warning. Renee's name flashed first. Check the news. It's blowing up. I frowned, opened my laptop, and typed my family's name into the search bar. Before I could talk myself out of it, Seattle Post. The perfect Hartman wedding. There they were. My parents, Margaret and Thomas, perfectly posed on a sunlit patio in Napa Valley. Emily stood between them, veil glittering, her husband's arm looped around her waist. My mother's smile was the kind that could convince strangers she'd never said a cruel word in her life. My father's hand rested protectively on Emily's shoulder. Everything looked polished, joyful, complete. Except me. I scrolled down through the glowing paragraphs, a celebration of family unity, a legacy of grace and strength. Then the comments started appearing. Wait, didn't they have another daughter? There's an old article about a Claire Hartman. Why isn't she in the photos? Ouch, that's cold. My chest tightened. Every line I read felt like an echo of something I'd tried to bury. When people try to erase you, the world always wants to know why you're missing. A notification popped up from Twitter. Lisa Grant, a local journalist known for digging into inspirational stories, her tweet sat at the top of my feed. Sources say there's more to the Hartman family story than meets the eye. Developing. I closed the laptop halfway, but it was too late. My phone rang again. The name on the screen made me go still. Mom. For a moment I let it ring. The cabin was quiet, except for the slow drip of the coffee maker. Then I picked it up. Claire. Her voice was tight, almost trembling. What did you do? I leaned against the counter. Hi, Mom. Good morning to you, too. This article, this mess, it's everywhere. Your aunt must have said something. You've made us look like fools. I bit back a laugh that wasn't funny. I didn't write the article. I didn't even know about it until 2 minutes ago. Then why are they talking about you? About us? Maybe because you made sure there was something to talk about, I said quietly. Her breath hitched on the other end. You're blaming me. I'm just saying I didn't erase anyone from those pictures. She was silent long enough that I could hear her breathing. Then in a smaller voice, You've always been dramatic, Claire. You love attention. I closed my eyes. No, Mom. I just stopped accepting invisibility. The line went quiet. I waited, half expecting the click of her hanging up. Do you have any idea what this could do to your sister? She finally asked. Yes, I said. I do. She'll survive. You always made sure she did. Don't turn this into revenge. She snapped, her composure cracking. I almost smiled. I don't have to. You already did it for me. And then she hung up. The cabin seemed to exhale with me, the quiet returning heavier than before. I set the phone down, poured my coffee, and walked out onto the porch. The tide was rolling in white foam, chasing itself across the sand. I stared at the horizon until my heartbeat slowed. The air smelled like metal and salt, the sky too bright to look at for long. My silence used to make them comfortable. Now it made them afraid. I went back inside, reopened the laptop, and watched as the article's comment section exploded. Hundreds of strangers dissecting my family's image, speculating, guessing. Someone had already found old photos from a charity event years ago, where my name appeared on a guest list. They were trying to piece me back into a story that had thrown me out. The irony was almost beautiful. I opened a drawer, pulled out a roll of tape, and tore a piece off with my teeth. The newspaper headline had already been printed online, but I printed it anyway, the ink still damp when I held it up. The perfect Hartman wedding. I taped it to the wall right beside my unfinished drawing of the train platform. 2 images side by side, one glossy one sketched, both incomplete. Outside, the waves hit harder, the sound of them mixing with the wind against the cabin walls. I stepped back and looked at the paper curling slightly at the corners, already giving in to the air. Maybe that's what truth did too. It warped over time, but it never disappeared. I turned off the laptop, the screen going dark, reflecting only my face. For a second, I thought I saw my mother's eyes in mine, but the resemblance faded as quickly as it came. The tide thundered again outside, and I let the sound fill the room. The paper on the wall fluttered once like it wanted to leave, then settled. I left it there. The coffee pot hissed like it was tired of working too. A week had passed since the article, and the storm it started hadn't slowed down. I sat at the small table in my cabin, the radio crackling through the morning fog. Breaking news, the anchor's voice said clear, even through static. Attorney Janet Cole, known for managing high-profile family trusts, is under investigation for financial fraud. Sources confirm the Hartman family is among those affected. My stomach clenched before I could stop it. I turned up the volume. The report continued, every word slicing through the air. Federal agents arrived at the Hartman residence early this morning. Footage shows Thomas and Margaret Hartman declining to comment. The couple's assets are currently frozen pending review. I glanced at the muted TV across the room. The image showed my parents' house in Bellevue, sleek and glassy, the kind of place meant to be seen. Outside, men in jackets marked FBI were walking up the driveway. My father's face flashed for half a second before he turned away from the camera. My mother had her coat pulled over her head like she could hide behind the fabric. I reached for the remote and shut it off. The silence that followed felt heavier than the broadcast. Ethan was sitting on the porch steps sanding a piece of driftwood. He looked up when I stepped outside. "You saw it?" he asked. "Yeah." He studied my face. "You okay?" I leaned against the railing, the wood warm from the morning sun. "I don't know what that means anymore." He hesitated. "Do you feel better?" I thought about it. "No," I said finally. "I just feel balanced, like gravity fixed itself for once." He nodded slowly. "Guess karma doesn't need your help. Karma never does," I said. "It just takes its time." He set the sandpaper down. Still, I didn't think it would hit them this hard. Neither did I admitted. But they built everything on keeping up appearances. It was only a matter of time before the mirror cracked. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the ocean, and something faintly metallic, like salt and rust and justice. My phone buzzed inside. I didn't move. "You gonna check that Ethan asked?" I said, but didn't. Eventually, the buzzing stopped. A few minutes later, it started again. I sighed and went in. Renee's name. I picked up. "Claire," she said, breathless. "Have you seen the news I just did? Not about your parents. About Cascade Media. What about them? They're getting dragged all over #corporate silence. Turns out you weren't the only woman HR blacklisted because of outside interference. The head of HR got fired this morning. Martin's stepping down too." I blinked. "That's fast." "Yeah. People are calling for a public apology. They even asked me if you'd comment." I laughed softly. "Of course they did." "Claire, this could be your redemption arc. They'll want you back." I looked out the window at the beach where Ethan was setting the wood he'd been sanding into place. "I don't think I want redemption. And I definitely don't want back." Renee sighed. "You could at least think about it." "No," I said gently. "They believed my mother over me. That's not a workplace. It's a mirror I already broke." She was quiet for a moment. "Then what now?" "Something smaller," I said. "Something that doesn't need to be perfect." When I hung up, Ethan was leaning against the porch post, arms crossed. "You looked serious on that call. Old life trying to recruit me." He smiled. And I declined the offer. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. "Good. I might have something better anyway." Oh, there's a community project in Portland, he said, restoring an old rec center. The city's funding it, but they need a designer. It's nothing fancy. Cracked paint, old benches, the smell of gym socks. Sounds glamorous. It's real, he said simply. Want in. I hesitated, then smiled. As long as the word perfect isn't anywhere in the proposal. He laughed. Deal. We spent the afternoon repairing the fence between our cabins. He hammered, I painted. The seagulls circled overhead, screaming like critics. Every now and then I'd catch him glancing at me, but he never said anything. Neither did I. The silence felt right, a kind of peace that didn't need permission. By sunset, the beach had turned to gold. The waves shimmered like they'd caught fire. I stood at the edge of the porch brush, still in hand, watching the tide roll out. The sand under my bare feet was warm, soft. For the first time in months, I smiled without it hurting. Justice didn't feel like revenge. It just felt quiet. The rain started as a whisper against the window, soft and hesitant, like it didn't want to interrupt. I had boxes, half-packed clothes folded into uneven piles, the kind of mess that only comes from leaving quietly. Portland was waiting. A new project, a new start. But I wasn't sure if I was ready for either. I wrapped a mug in paper when my phone began to ring. The sound cut through the cabin like a blade. I glanced at the screen. Mom, my hand hovered over it. For a moment I let it ring, watching the screen light up, fade, then light up again. On the fourth ring, I answered. Claire. Her voice was thin, trembling, surrounded by noise. An echo, a crowd. Then I heard it, the low rumble of an arriving train, the announcement over a loudspeaker. I'm at the station, she said. I just needed to call. I swallowed. Why? There was a pause filled with static and the hiss of brakes. Because I was wrong, she said, her voice cracking. I was so sure I was protecting us. I was just protecting myself. The background sounds painted a picture I didn't need to see, metal on metal, heels on concrete, rain on glass. I never wanted to lose you, Claire. I only wanted peace. I closed my eyes. Peace isn't something you get by erasing people, Mom. I know, her breathing caught. I just didn't want you to ruin Emily's day. I thought keeping you away would keep things calm. I didn't think... She trailed off, a small sob filling the space where her words should have gone. You didn't think I'd disappear? I finished for her. She hesitated. No, I didn't. The sound of another announcement came through train 226 to San Francisco boarding now. I could hear footsteps, suitcases, rolling voices blending. I don't want to do this anymore, she said quietly. The pretending. The silence. It's too heavy. Her voice broke again, and for a second I heard the woman who used to hum to herself in the kitchen. Not the one who'd become a stranger in her own house. Can you come home? She whispered. Please. The question hung there fragile and wet. I stared at the half-empty cabin, at the sketches still pinned to the wall. The train, the platform, the empty space where I'd drawn myself once but erased later. Home isn't where it used to be. Mom, she sniffled. I don't care. I want to see you. The train horn cut through her words deep and low. I felt it in my chest before I heard it in my ear. I could picture her standing there, coat pulled tight, rain soaking the edges of her hair, watching people climb aboard, as if she might follow them. You taught me about peace, I said softly. I'm just doing what you wanted. Claire, please don't hang up. But I couldn't listen anymore. My thumb pressed the screen and the line went dead. The rain outside picked up again, steadier now. I set the phone on the counter and stood there listening to the faint sound of the train horn fading away into the distance. It sounded just like that morning years ago, the same steel rhythm, the same ache of departure. But this time, I didn't chase it. I sat down on the floor, leaning my back against the wall. The wood felt cool through my sweater. I closed my eyes, the soft hum of the rain mixing with the echo of her voice in my head. She'd said she wanted peace. She finally got it. Just not the kind she meant. Light from the window moved across the room as the clouds shifted, falling across my face in pale streaks. I wasn't crying. There was nothing left that needed tears. I thought about all the versions of my mother I'd known, the one who scolded, the one who smiled for photographs, the one who hid behind her fear. Maybe this was the last one, the one who finally admitted she was afraid of losing what she'd already lost. There are apologies that come too late to change anything. But sometimes timing isn't the point. Sometimes it's just the sound of someone finally saying it out loud. The wind rattled the window. Once, then quieted. I whispered to the empty room. There are some apologies that arrive right on time. It's just that no one's left to hear them. The rain softened again, and in the distance another train passed. Its horn faded into the sound of waves until both were indistinguishable from the silence that followed. 2 months slipped by like fog dissolving over the ocean. The world kept moving even when mine had stopped noticing. The morning news ran louder than the waves outside. Every major outlet had the same headline plastered across the screen: "The perfect family crumbles." Images of my parents' Bellevue mansion flashed across the TV, agents walking through the front gate boxes being loaded into vans. A reporter's voice filled the small cabin. The Hartman family is under full investigation for tax fraud and undisclosed asset transfers. Emily Brooks, social media influencer and youngest daughter of Thomas and Margaret Hartman, has lost multiple sponsorships. Thomas Hartman has resigned from the board of Cascade Financial. I stared at the screen, my coffee untouched. They taught me to protect appearances. Now appearance is the only thing chasing them. The kettle clicked, breaking the trance. I poured the coffee, turned off the TV, and opened the windows to let the sea breeze in. The air smelled like salt and endings. By noon, the sound of gravel under tires pulled me out of thought. A familiar red car stopped in front of the cabin. Renee stepped out, sunglasses clipboard, and that same unstoppable energy that had once made deadlines feel like challenges instead of punishments. She waved a stack of papers at me. Guess who's officially back in business? I met her halfway to the porch. What's that? She grinned. Heartline Studio. Articles of incorporation, business license, the works. She handed them over like they were something fragile. I looked at the top page. Heartline. I read aloud. What's the name mean? Your name, she said simply. Hartman. And timeline. The place you stopped, and the line where you start again. I felt something small break open in my chest, something that had been locked tight for years. That's actually beautiful. You're welcome. She smiled. And before you ask, yes, I already filed the tax ID. You can thank me later. Ethan appeared from around the side of the cabin, carrying a wooden board taller than both of us. The letters were carved deep and clean. Heartline Studio. Didn't know we were getting a sign, I said. He shrugged. Every place deserves one, even if it's just a reminder that you built something on your own. Renee raised an eyebrow. He's handy and philosophical. I like him. Ethan laughed, setting the board against the porch. Want to help me put it up? I hesitated. You're asking the girl who almost failed woodshop. Then you'll fit right in. He handed me a hammer warm from his grip. We found a clear spot on the porch railing where the afternoon sun hit perfectly. Renee sat on the steps watching with a smirk while Ethan held the board steady, and I lined up the first nail. The first strike wobbled. The second hit straight. By the third, the rhythm settled. Hammer, pause, hammer. Ethan's hand brushed mine when he adjusted the edge. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was something better. Shared easy. When the last nail went in, we both stepped back. The letters caught the light. Heartline Studio. The ocean wind lifted my hair, the kind of gentle, forgiving wind that smelled like freedom. I could hear gulls calling, waves hitting the rocks, the low hum of Ethan's quiet satisfaction beside me. Renee snapped a photo on her phone. Look at that. You actually look happy. Don't ruin it by pointing it out, I said. But I smiled anyway. She rolled her eyes and stood. I'll head back to Portland tomorrow, start looking for clients. We'll make this thing real. When she left, Ethan and I stayed on the porch, the light turning amber around us. He leaned on the railing. You ever think about how fast things fall apart? All the time, I said. He nodded. But maybe that's the only way they can make space for what's supposed to come next. I looked at the sign again, the way the setting sun traced each carved letter with gold. Maybe, I said softly. Or maybe it's just about learning to stay when things stop being perfect. He smiled, faint but warm. You've got a way of making imperfection sound holy. I had good teachers, I said, glancing at him. He shook his head. No, Claire. You had hard ones. That's different. We stood there until the sun dropped low enough that the letters on the sign turned bronze. The waves below caught the light, bending it, scattering it back like liquid fire. Sometimes you don't need an apology to start over. You just have to stop waiting for one. The last of the sunlight hit the H on the sign before slipping away. For a moment it gleamed so bright it looked alive, steel against the soft shimmer of the sea. I took a deep breath, let it fill the quiet, and said nothing at all. Spring arrived in Portland like a secret. Quiet, almost shy. The cherry blossoms along the river bloomed in patches, as if the city couldn't quite commit to beauty yet. My apartment sat above a small coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where strangers talked about art like it could save them. I'd been here 6 months long enough for the walls to forget the smell of the sea, long enough for me to stop counting days since the last phone call. That morning, a small envelope waited in my mailbox, tucked between bills and flyers. The return address was written in a careful, shaky script. Lorraine Davis. I brought it upstairs, sat on the couch, and stared at it for a full minute before opening it. Inside was another envelope, older yellowing at the edges. My name was written across the front in my mother's handwriting, uneven, as if each letter had been pulled from somewhere that hurt. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I ran my thumb over the curve of the sea the same way I used to trace her signature on school permission slips. Then I opened it. Claire. It began. I used to believe silence was punishment. I used it that way. I thought if I stayed quiet, I could control what got broken. I see now that silence isn't punishment. It's surrender. And sometimes surrender is the only way to stop hurting people you love. If you don't want to come home, I understand. I only need you to know. I see you now. The handwriting wavered halfway down the page, ink smudged like it had met a tear before drying. I read it twice, then a third time. My hands were shaking not from anger, but from the strange lightness of realizing she had finally said the one thing I'd waited my entire life to hear, I see you. The tears that came weren't sharp or loud. They just fell quietly, like the kind that know exactly where to go. I set the letter on the coffee table beside another envelope that had traveled a longer path. One from my grandmother Evelyn Monroe, written years before she died. Her words had been different, but carried the same weight. You can love people and still walk away. 3 generations, 3 different ways of saying goodbye. My grandmother had loved through honesty, my mother through fear, and me through distance. 3 ways to love, 3 ways to lose. I sat there for a long time, sunlight crawling slowly across the floor. The room smelled faintly of paint and rosemary from the candle I'd left burning the night before. I pulled the small wooden box from the bookshelf, the one Aunt Lorraine had given me months ago, the one that had started this quiet untying of knots. Inside were the hospital report, the old photograph of my mother by the train, and now I added the letter. I smoothed the paper before folding it like it might tear if I rushed. I lit a candle on the table. Its flame wavered with the breeze sneaking in through the open window. The light reflected off the wall, casting shadows that looked almost like movement. For the first time, I didn't feel angry at her. I didn't feel much of anything except stillness, a kind I hadn't known before. I whispered to the empty room. 3 women, 3 ways to survive. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing through the branches of the tree outside my window. The flame flickered, then steadied. The paper inside the box shifted slightly, rustling like a small sigh. I sat back and watched the shadows move. In the distance, faint but clear, came the sound of a train. The tracks ran along the edge of the city too far to see, but I could imagine the lights sliding past, soft and yellow, cutting through the dark. The same sound that used to sting now felt almost like a heartbeat, a rhythm that kept going no matter who left. I stood and closed the window halfway, letting just enough air in to make the candle dance. Then I placed the lid on the box and closed it gently. I had spent so long thinking loss was the end of things, but sometimes it's just the pause before something new begins. The flame flickered one more time, catching in the reflection of the glass. And for a second I thought I saw her there. My mother, smiling just once the way she never could in person. I blinked, and she was gone. The train's whistle echoed again, fading into the hum of the city. I whispered almost to myself. Maybe this is peace after all. The candle burned steady. The room exhaled. The box stayed closed. A year later, Portland felt like home, in a way no place ever had. The city hummed with its own rhythm. Rain on rooftops, laughter. Leaking out of coffee shops, the distant rattle of streetcars. I'd learned to love its grayness, how it made light feel like a gift instead of a guarantee. Heartline Studio had survived its first year, maybe even more than survived. We'd taken on small clients, local shops, nonprofits, a few startups, and somehow built something honest, something steady. Tonight was different, though. Our first gallery showcase. Renee and I had spent weeks painting walls, adjusting lights, arguing over music playlists, until we landed on something soft enough to let people breathe. The studio smelled like fresh paint and jasmine candles. The walls were white, the light golden, and in the center, on its own freestanding wall, hung the largest piece I'd ever finished. The platform. A woman stood alone in the painting, her back to the viewer, facing a train that was already moving. The fog around her was soft, not mournful, and her reflection in the window showed a faint smile. I was still adjusting a small label at the bottom of the frame when the door opened. Ethan walked in carrying a bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. His hair was damp from the rain. "You're early," I said. "Traffic's a mess," he said, setting the flowers on a nearby table. "Figured I'd come before the crowd does." He glanced at the painting. "So this is the one," I nodded. "The one that almost broke me to finish." He studied it for a long time, the corners of his mouth tilting into something like pride. "It's beautiful. She looks free." "She is," I said quietly. He looked back at me, still afraid of trains. I smiled. "No, I just don't need to get on one that isn't mine anymore." He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that doesn't need a reason. Renee came in from his back, her heels clicking against the floor, a clipboard in hand. "Everything's ready." Music cued drinks out front. "You two look nice, by the way, like you belong in a magazine about people who survived something tragic and started a company about it." Ethan grinned. "We'll take it." Guests started trickling in soon after. The air filled with polite chatterglasses, clinking low music, humming under it all. I moved through the room slowly, greeting people, answering questions, pretending not to notice how my hands shook a little. Every so often, I caught someone staring at the platform longer than the other pieces. A few whispered. One woman asked if the story behind it was real. I just said parts of it. Renee raised her glass across the room. To Heartline she called out, and the guests joined her. To building something out of what's left. I raised mine too, and the words felt right. Later, when the crowd thinned and the noise softened, I stood by the painting again. The lights from the street stretched through the tall windows, striping the floor with gold. People kept asking me if this was a revenge story. I never had a good answer. My silence had already said everything, because revenge isn't always about making someone pay. Sometimes it's just refusing to be erased. Ethan came to stand beside me. "You look peaceful," he said. "I am." I said, "Finally." Outside, a streetcar passed its lights, gliding across the glass painting, moving shadows over the wall. For a second, it looked like the train in my painting was coming alive, the light flickering across the woman's figure before fading again. Ethan followed my gaze. Funny, isn't it, how something that used to hurt can look beautiful once you stop chasing it? "Yeah," I said. "It's like the sound changed meaning." He nodded. "Like you did." I smiled at that. Maybe I did. He handed me another glass of wine, and we stood there for a while, quiet, watching the reflections of strangers drift through the windows. The night deepened. The laughter turned soft, distant. Renee turned the music down to a low hum. Through the glass, I saw another train in the distance. Real this time, not painted, cutting across the city lights, its cars shining in rhythm. It didn't sound sad anymore, just alive. They took the train without me, and that's how I finally arrived. The room exhaled, with the faint sound of rain starting again. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it settle. When I opened them, the guests were smiling, the lights were warm, and the platform glowed quietly in the center of it all. An ending that didn't need to prove anything. If you've ever been left behind, remember this piece isn't where they went. It's where you decide to stop running. And somewhere out there the train keeps moving. But this time it doesn't take anything from you.